Hello everyone. It is a small rocky island that lies half a mile off the coast of Normandy in France. A coastal island like many others, but this one looks like it comes straight out of a fantasy world or a medieval legend. The island seems to be reaching for the sky, with its vertical profile that contrasts with the perfectly flat and horizontal bay around it. It is topped by Gothic-style buildings, an abbey, that accentuate its verticality. It is surrounded with medieval walls that protect many other historical buildings on the mountain slope that leads to the abbey and its spire. The architecture alone suggests a rich history, and together with the natural beauty of the site, it made the Mont Saint-Michel, St. Michael's Mount, a world-famous site. But how and why did this wonder appear? What happened there? The story of the mount started more than a millennium ago. And this is what we are going to explore tonight. This is actually going to be the first of several episodes about wonders of the Middle Ages in Western Europe. Cathedrals, abbeys, fortresses. The medieval period left a large number of spectacular works. And this little series will take us from the Tower of London to St. Mark's Basilica in Venice, with other stops in Italy, for the towers of Bologna. In Germany, I will tell you about Charlemagne's palace in Aachen, or in France for Notre-Dame de Paris or the Abbey of Cluny. These will also be pretexts to tell you about architecture, society, politics and history in general, especially Christianization and the development of Monasticism, the formation of kingdoms or merchant republics like Venice, the worldviews of medieval societies, the 100 Years' War, and many more things. When the series is complete, I will also publish all episodes together for those of you who like longer stories. So make yourself comfortable. As usual, we will go through all of this slowly and in a way that is easy to follow, even if you have no knowledge at all of this period and these places. Before we begin, remember that you can also listen to my stories on Spotify, Apple Music, and other audio streaming services. There are links in the description and the first comment pinned under this video. And if you want more, like the audios with background sounds, downloads of everything I make, surveys, early releases, a chat for followers, a private RSS link to listen to episodes on podcast sites. There is also Patreon, which is the best way to support this channel. And you can access all this for the monthly pledge you want, starting at $1, £1 or €1. And now, let's begin our journey. Imagine yourself on the coast of Normandy, surrounded by a light mist and the sound of the waves as the tide starts to recede. As the waters pull back, a causeway emerges, inviting you to tread the same path that so many pilgrims have walked for centuries, for more than 1,000 years. Ahead is the harmonious figure of the Mont Saint-Michel hilltop abbey, on top of a rock where many old houses and buildings are perched. As you make your way up the narrow streets, you realize how steep they are, and how building all this must have been challenging. Because now the tide has changed, and the waters are coming back surprisingly quickly. The causeway disappears, and for a few hours, the Mont Saint-Michel becomes an island again. Under the Gothic masterpiece that is the Abbey is a more secret world, a world of crypts and hidden chambers dug into the rock or built to support the mass of the sanctuary. We could almost hear the chants of generations of monks who lived, prayed, worked, and died here, in a place that seems to be a meeting point between the earthly and the sacred. So, what is this Mont Saint-Michel exactly? And why does it deserve to be included among wonders of the Middle Ages? The known history of this little island, because it is small, only 1.5 square mile or 4 square kilometers, so its history begins with the christianization of the region, around the 6th or the 7th century. The mount is what is called a tidal island. That is to say, its connection to the larger mainland depends on tides. At low tide, it is not an island, and it can be reached by foot. But at high tide, all accesses are submerged. Now, why a rocky island in the middle of a sandy bay? It looks strange. The main type of rock the mount is made of is granite, which is a magmatic rock. It forms directly from magma underground in the earth crust. Underground forces made this mass of granite emerge in the middle of what was a flat plain. At the time of the Pleistocene, the Ice Age, when sea levels around the world were lower than today, the mount was just a big hill in the middle of a plain. At the end of the Pleistocene, when water rose, many islands appeared around the world, lands that were now separated from larger land masses from continents. This mount was at the limit. It could have become an island if its base had been lower and if it had been constantly surrounded by the sea. But because it was just at the limit on the edge, it became a tidal island. Maybe there was a prehistoric settlement on it, even though no trace of it was ever found. Because for prehistoric men, this is the kind of location that could have made sense. The island always offered a great defensive position. Its surroundings are famous for being very dangerous when the tide arrives. The geography of the bay, which is almost perfectly flat, means that when the tide rises, water arrives very fast, like a running horse, and it cannot be escaped by people, even if they run. These tides are also some of the most spectacular observed in Europe, again due to the geography. Water can rise by up to 15 meters. So, if people are surprised by the rising tide, in the space between the mount and the coastline, they suddenly see water rising by up to several inches per minute around them. And they have to walk on a treacherous ground made of sand, so unstable that in different parts it turns to quicksand. Along the the centuries, many stories appeared of people surprised by the tide, who drowned or were taken away to disappear forever. This natural position makes the Mont Saint-Michel almost impossible to besiege. No army can stay around it. And the coast was too far away in medieval times to use siege weapons against it. So, even before anything was built there, in prehistory or antiquity, the island could have provided a good defensive position to people willing to live there. Maybe from a bit of agriculture. There is not much space, but a clan could have found it to be enough. Or fishing, or shell gathering. We don't know if that happened. But what we know is that at the latest in the early 8th century, an oratory, that is to say a small chapel dedicated to the Archangel Saint Michael, was built on the rock. There could have been earlier oratories in the 6th or the 7th centuries, with a few hermits populating the island. But this is only speculative, because it was mentioned in later documents, and no archaeological proof was ever found. This oratory, this chapel to Saint Michael, would be the original nucleus of the abbey that developed on the mount later. The local bishop sent a dozen of clerics to live near the new sanctuary and serve the pilgrims that would visit it. Legend has it that the bishop that ordered the construction of this sanctuary had been visited in a dream by the Archangel Michael himself, and the Archangel would have ordered him to create this oratory. Probably shortly after, inhabitants coming from the continent settled on the island and built a hamlet, probably living from supplying the religious community and the pilgrims. Another reason for inhabitants to move on the mount at the time, in the 8th century, was certainly to seek refuge from Viking raids. In the 8th century, Western Europe was discovering this new menace coming from the north, the Scandinavian Norsemen that launched expeditions to attack, loot, and capture slaves in Great Britain, the Low Countries, France, Germany, and the coasts of the Baltic. So to understand this period a bit better, we need to take a look at what Western Europe was like at the beginning of the 8th century. This was a time when none of the modern European countries existed yet. After the Western Roman Empire had disappeared 400 years earlier, the different peoples that had invaded it or settled within its frontiers created kingdoms. Many of these peoples were of Germanic origins. The Angles and the Saxons in Britain, for example, the Visigoths in Spain, or the Franks in France. With the disappearance of Roman administration, there had been a huge setback in terms of infrastructure, of standards of living, urbanization. The population had dropped too. But it doesn't mean the antique heritage of Rome had completely disappeared. The new Germanic or barbarian kingdoms that replaced the empire were heavily influenced by Rome. The Latin language had survived as the international language and the language of knowledge. And another major legacy of Rome was Christianity. Christianization had started within the limits of the Roman Empire from the 1st century, and it went on after its fall, giving a common reference to all these different regions of Western, Central, and Eastern Europe. But Christianization took time, and by the early 8th century, when our story of the Mont Saint-Michel begins, Christianity was still fighting the influence of pagan religions, Celtic in the west of France, Great Britain or Ireland, Norse or Germanic in northern and central Europe. In what was called Francia, and would one day become France, the process was already well advanced, because the kings that reigned over much of the territory that would become France one day had converted several generations earlier. Most of France, including Normandy, was controlled by a dynasty of Frankish kings. The Franks were a group of Germanic peoples that had settled around the Rhine River and the northern half of France. So these Frankish kings formed a dynasty called the Merovingians, and they remained in power for about 300 years until they were sidelined by another clan that previously served them but became so influential and ambitious that they took the crown of the Franks from them and ruled as a new dynasty, the Carolingians. The most famous of these Carolingians was Charlemagne, who reunited a large part of Western Europe under his authority in the late 8th and early 9th centuries. We will return to Charlemagne and these political changes in an upcoming episode. But this is to say that by 700–710, when the Mont Saint-Michel started to be populated and the first buildings appeared, the Merovingian kings were still in power. But as the island gained importance as a destination for pilgrims along the 8th century, the Merovingians declined and were finally ousted by the Carolingians. As I told you, the 8th and 9th centuries were very dangerous times for anyone living near the coasts of Normandy or Great Britain for that matter, because Viking raids multiplied. And that was certainly a first reason why the Mont Saint-Michel was populated. It offered a bit more safety. But a second and probably more important reason was Christianization, the expansion of Christianity. The Church had to occupy space, had to organize the space of Christendom. And it did it physically by creating parishes, building churches, placing priests, and defining different zones controlled by a bishop. The bishops had become very important figures of authority. But space also had to be occupied symbolically, by making the presence and the dominion of the Church visible, obvious. A country displays flags that are visible. The Church put crosses. Beyond the legend of Saint Michael appearing to the bishop to ask for the creation of an oratory, this was probably the real reason why the mount was turned into a sanctuary. The site was striking by itself, with this isolated rock dominating a perfectly flat bay and offering a safe refuge to the dangerous tides. All this made it visually and symbolically perfect for a sanctuary. It was good for the Church to claim all this symbolism, to plant a cross on it. Now, was it due to its defensive position, or the protection of the Archangel, or just luck? It seems the sanctuary was not attacked by the Vikings in the 8th or 9th centuries, not that we know of at least. and it seems it remained in peace as a minor destination for pilgrims. In the 10th century, the Mont Saint-Michel was attached to the Duchy of Normandy, which had been recently created. Basically, this region was offered to Norse settlers, to Vikings, by the King of France in the early 10th century, in exchange for tranquility. Tranquility because the Vikings kept raiding the area, and even went inland. They sailed on the Seine River, reaching Paris that they tried to attack a few times. So some of the Vikings that attacked the region were offered a deal: a green and tempered region, Normandy, the land of the Normands, the Norsemen, with a title of Count for their leader, a chief called Rollo. The counts expanded later, and the county became a duchy. The right to raise taxes, all of this in exchange for peace, allegiance to the king, and protection against other Vikings. Because now the Normans, installed in Normandy, had valuable possessions to defend against other Norse expeditions. The Normans quickly expanded westward at the expense of Brittany, their neighbor, and they seized control of the surroundings of the mount. Under control of the Dukes of Normandy, the initial group of a dozen clerics that lived on the mount was replaced by a monastery in the 10th century. And thanks to the patronage of the Dukes of Normandy, the mount became increasingly popular as a site of pilgrimage and increasingly wealthy. The religious community living on the mount was a Benedictine monastery, a Benedictine abbey. But what does it mean exactly? The importance of monasticism in the Middle Ages is hard to overstate. If we want to understand medieval society, economy, and the transmission of knowledge, we need to take a look at monasteries. Monastic life, the choice for monks or nuns to retire from the world, at least partially, and live in communities around religious principles, to dedicate a large part of their lives to prayer and worshipping. This is not something mentioned in the Bible or in any of the early texts of Christianity. Christian monasticism appeared progressively in the first centuries of our era. This is something we will explore in detail in a future talk. But what matters tonight is that as Europe was Christianized, monasticism had a remarkable development and recruited massively. There were different ways of organizing the communities, and the most influential figure in the history of Christian monasticism was probably Saint Benedict of Nursia, an Italian monk. In the 6th century, he created a rule, a book of precepts for communities to organize themselves and their lives. The rule of Saint Benedict emphasizes the importance of a balance, the establishment of a peaceful environment. Actually, the motto of the Benedictines is peace. An environment in which monks and nuns can pray, work, and study. The Benedictines also go by the formula ora et labora, in Latin, which means pray and work. Work is seen by this rule first as a source of income for the community to support itself, but also as a healthy practice. that connects the monks to human condition, humbles them, and occupies them physically. Things that are important, including for their spiritual life. The rule of Saint Benedict also emphasizes the importance of study. Monks should elevate themselves intellectually and spiritually as they advance in their religious life. The rule also calls for the welcoming of strangers. It is quite detailed. But a constant preoccupation in it is to avoid excess, to avoid punitive or ostentatious practices. And every part of the rule is explained. It has a function that contributes to a spiritual goal. At the time when it was written, this rule was very moderate and seen as well balanced, because much more extreme practices existed among monks. Some would starve themselves, inflict pain on themselves, things that are completely absent from the rule of Saint Benedict. And from the start it was very successful. It still is, in a sense. Monasticism has receded dramatically in modern times, and there are way less monks and nuns than a few centuries ago. But the rule of Saint Benedict is still the most widely followed by monasteries, by religious communities in Catholic monasteries. The most followed rule, but not the only one. Other rules appeared in the Middle Ages and after. New rules for different orders of religious communities, like the Dominicans and the Franciscans in the 13th century, or the Reformed, the so-called decalced Carmelites in the 16th century. These all became important orders, following different rules than the rule of Saint Benedict, but their founders, Saint Dominic, Saint Francis of Assisi, or Saint Teresa of Avila, all knew very well the rule of Saint Benedict and took it into account when elaborating their teachings. So, in Western Christian monasticism, Saint Benedict is regarded as the OG, the inspiration for a large part of this rich tradition. A Benedictine monastery means that the community at the Mont Saint-Michel followed the rule of Saint Benedict, which was very common in the 10th century. The ulterior Dominican or Franciscan reforms had not happened yet, and a majority of monasteries followed it in Western Europe. This meant that the monks at the Mont Saint-Michel spent their days praying together in several gatherings each day, and separately in their cell, which are their bedrooms, or even all day long, whatever they were doing. Seen from the outside, many monastic rules can seem really harsh. Poverty, life behind walls, with few contacts with the outside world, an obligation of silence. But all of these things are not intended to be a form of punishment or even penance. They are ways to simplify one's existence, to make it available for prayer and the presence of God. For example, the rule of silence, which exists to an extent in all Christian monasteries, is a way of sparing the others the noise or the small talk that would interrupt their continuous prayer. To non-believers, it sounds like a punishment, but no monks or nuns lives it as one. On the contrary, it is a relief that allows them to not have to care about social interactions during most of the day. Most of the day, but not all the time. Because there are always times when silence is broken. All rules, including Saint Benedict's, and also in communities where silence is particularly sought after, like the Carmelites. Make room for recreation times, when members of the community can speak, joke, and laugh as much as they want, before returning to silence and their continuous prayer. Part of the success of Saint Benedict's rule is that it allowed for that kind of balance mechanism in the life of religious communities. So I was telling you that monasteries were particularly important in medieval times. First, because Christianity was particularly important in general in society, and choosing a religious life was something very common and well accepted. Second, because as the Middle Ages advanced, monasteries, also called abbeys, when they had an abbot or an abbess at their head, increasingly became economic centers. Economic centers because they received gifts from nobles to ordinary people. They inherited assets or received some brought by their founders or their patrons, and with this they could own land, invest, grow. Some abbeys became economic powerhouses along the Middle Ages, seeding more monasteries and even forming networks of sister communities that could have major influence financially or politically. The accumulation of wealth in abbeys was certainly a chance for the redevelopment of the economy along the Middle Ages, and for the creation of libraries. One of the works monks did was copying books. And given that in Saint Benedict's rule they also had to study and be able to read, the monasteries, especially the largest ones, were also centers of intellectual life and technical progress. Many medieval inventions were discovered or bettered by monks, from mechanical processes to fermentation of foods and beverages to medicine. Soon, medieval universities would start to provide another ground for intellectual activities to flourish. But before that, from the 5th to the 9th and 10th centuries, monasteries became crucial in the preservation of knowledge. Now, this wealth could also be a curse, and monasteries also drew criticism for the accumulation of assets and revenues, sometimes for the fancy life that abbots adopted. As always, there is the rule and the ideals, and there is the practice. In Christian monasteries, like in the rest of society, the difference between principles and reality could be huge. But still, monasteries became very important institutions, and on top of their intellectual and economic importance, they were also part of the social system. They made society work. Monasteries provided food and temporary shelters to the poor or to refugees. They cared for the sick. They organized or paid for all sorts of charitable initiatives that made them much more familiar and probably perceived as welcoming than they are today. Nowadays, their social role has been taken over by charities, governments, and even businesses, if we think about healthcare or hospitality. Monasteries or religious congregations were not the only providers of these services. In the Middle Ages, parishes or other charitable institutions also did it, but still they were very well integrated with the communities that lived near them. And for travelers or pilgrims, which was the case at the Mont Saint-Michel, they were also a kind of hotel, a place where to stay. I am telling you all this because these are the reasons behind the transformation of this little island with no resources or strategic importance into an urbanized religious center. To understand it, we need to take into account the importance of monasteries, economically, intellectually, socially. Also, the willingness of the Catholic Church to occupy the land, to affirm its presence. Yet another aspect is the dangers of the time and the need for a natural defensive position. Without this very particular set of natural and historical conditions, it could not have existed. So now that we have seen its origins, let's explore it and see how it progressively built up to get to the state that is visible today. I told you the initial group of clerics that had been sent to take care of St. Michael's oratory had been replaced by a Benedictine monastery. This replacement took place in 966, so by the middle of the 10th century. And it seems it was imposed by the Duke of Normandy, because the caretakers of the mount had lost their ways and did not live the kind of quiet, contemplative life that was expected from them. The circumstances are unclear, but by 966 the monastery was in place. And this is considered the foundation of the Mont Saint-Michel Abbey, a Benedictine abbey. In the 11th century, the relatively small stone buildings on the island were complemented with a larger church in Romanesque architecture, which was the standard at the time. Typically, a monastery has a place of worship. It can be a church or at least a chapel, or there can be several chapels. It has common rooms like kitchens or dining rooms, a refectory, and as many cells as there are monks or nuns. In medieval monasteries, these buildings for everyday life were often organized around a square court or a garden with a cloister around it. Cloisters, which are common in convents in monasteries, but can also be found in old colleges or cathedrals, are covered walks with a colonnade on one side that opens to this court or this garden. This is typically the image associated with medieval monasteries or old universities. Medieval religious architecture used it a lot. And actually, cloistered or claustral also became other terms for the life of a nun or a monk, a cloistered life. But the origins of the cloister as an architectural form are more ancient than that. They can be found in Greco-Roman houses. Not common houses, but the type of house used by the upper class, the domus, which was organized around a court surrounded by a covered walk. This kind of atrium was later used to build Roman basilicas, and that's how it moved from domestic to religious architecture. So, by the 11th century, when this first large church was built on the Mont Saint-Michel, it was in Romanesque style. That is to say, a style of stone building derived from ancient Roman architecture. Romanesque later evolved into the Gothic style, but then, by the 11th century, it still dominated. Romanesque was always relatively massive, with thick walls and columns, and small windows. Some techniques in Romanesque helped build higher, despite the very heavy walls, like the use of buttresses that is to say, structures built against the walls to strengthen them and help them bear a heavier load. But overall, Romanesque architecture was quite sturdy, which has its charm. The shapes are simple, and it is often said that the Gothic style, with its ornamentation and height, tends to elevate you, to make you look up and have a feeling of vertigo almost. In contrast, the Romanesque style anchors you to the ground, to the earth, and it can have something comforting. It gives a sense of strength. So that was the style of this first large church, and an audacious bet was made to build it. The bet to place the transept crossing, that is to say, the center, the place where the two rectangles forming a cross meet where they cross, just at the very top of the mount. The transept crossing in such a church, or in most medieval churches and cathedrals, is the location above which a spire would be built. And so this spire would be above the highest natural point of the island, which accentuates its height, obviously, and gives this feeling that the buildings and the rock above which they are built are one single thing. When we look at pictures of the mount, it is as if the construction started at the sea level, because the rock is completely absorbed, enclosed by the abbey that tops it. But in order to place this very heavy Romanesque church so high above the rock, a lot of preparation work had to be done. Underground supports with huge pillars and walls, which created many underground crypts and chapels built around the rock or dug into it. This supportive upward structure, this elevated platform upon which the church of the abbey was placed, still exists today, even though it was later expanded and more constructions were added. So a lot of mysterious crypts and invisible places were created at the time, by the mid-11th century. As the mount gained even more reputation as a destination for pilgrims, thanks to its stunning location, its new spectacular church, and the influence of the Dukes of Normandy too, who were now well integrated into the Kingdom of France. They had dropped their Viking cultural traits, they had become good Christians, and the Duchy of Normandy was one of the main constituents of the Kingdom of France, one of the main vassals to the new dynasty of French kings, the Capetians. But at the time, apart from this Romanesque abbey on top and a few wood and adobe houses under it, the rock of the island was still visible. There were no fortifications, and the golden age, or the apex of the mount, was still to come. From the late 11th century to the 15th century, including all of the 100 Years' War between France and England, the mount regularly saw a new construction. The first important change that happened just as the Romanesque church was built was the conquest of William the Conqueror, or Guillaume le Conquérant, Duke of Normandy, who claimed the crown of England. He landed in England and conquered it against rival pretenders. He owed this victory, in particular, to his triumph at the Battle of Hastings in 1066. So now the Dukes of Normandy were also kings of England, and of course that created a potentially explosive situation with the kings of France, who now had the kings of a rival kingdom owning a share of their own kingdom. that was complicated and wars would ensue. Not the 100 Years' War yet, but in the 13th century, the French king, Philip II, also known as Philip Augustus, attacked and annexed a good part of Normandy. Even if you think you have never heard of that story, in fact you must probably have. The King of England and the Duke of Normandy at the time was John Lackland, the brother of King Richard I, Richard the Lionheart. When Richard went to the Holy Land to participate in the Third Crusade alongside his French and German equivalents, John stayed as the administrator, the regent of the kingdom and the possessions of the dynasty. But as Richard stayed in the Holy Land, Philip II, the King of France, returned to France. And after Richard's death, John succeeded his brother on the throne. Seeing a rival weakened because John's administration and general situation was not the best, as the King of England was faced with the hostility of his vassals, Philip II took the opportunity and attacked. He reconquered all he could on the continent, including Normandy. The result of that was that the Capetian dynasty increased its power dramatically under Philip II. That's why in historiography and popular culture, John Lackland always had a bad reputation. He is seen as one of the worst English sovereigns ever. And in popular culture, he has a villainous profile. He is the bad guy in the Robin Hood folklore. Historians have a more balanced view of John Lackland. He certainly had a rather disastrous reign, and it seems bad personality traits like cruelty or pettiness. But he could also have been a hardworking and able administrator and general. It is always hard to judge the character of these faraway historical figures when we have mostly unreliable and biased sources to work with. Anyway, the Abbey suffered from this conflict. It had prospered before and created branches in England, but it lost the revenues that came from them. And the Abbey was also damaged by a siege, the only one ever to have been successful. A siege led during the war by the Duke of Brittany, an ally of the King of France. So after the war, Philip II paid for repairs and improvements that modified again and dramatically the profile of the mount. The new fashionable style was now Gothic, and Philip II gave the abbot a grant to build an entire Gothic-style set with new buildings, including a refectory, a dining room, and a new Gothic cloister. Between 1211 and 1228, very opulent Gothic buildings were added, and they are collectively called La Merveille, the Wonder. On 3 levels, they include multiple rooms of the Abbey that reflect the refinement of the Gothic style at this time, in the local Norman style, because Gothic is more like an architectural language and a list of techniques. It took different local styles across Europe. During the 100 Years' War that started in 1337, the English landed in France and reconquered Normandy, almost all of it, but not entirely, because the Mount did not surrender. And along more than a century of conflict, it was besieged and attacked several times. It progressively fortified in the 14th and 15th centuries, mainly due to the 100 Years' War, to repel these attacks. And thanks to the tides and these fortifications, it always resisted, until the French reconquest of Normandy in 1450. So, along these decades of conflict, the Mount became a symbol of French resistance, a symbol rather than a strategically important military position. Medieval fortresses were useful essentially because attackers could not leave them behind. They had garrisons, or they could house entire armies that could attack invaders in the back. So fortresses had to be captured. And this often meant lengthy sieges or negotiations to make them surrender. The Mount was never home to any army or large garrisons that could have threatened to attack anything outside. It only had a few dozen defenders at most. This is why capturing it was more symbolic than strategic. But still, despite several assaults by up to 2,000 soldiers, it resisted thanks to its very strong natural defensive position. So that by the 15th century, when the 100 Years' War ended, the Mount already had half a millennium of long and tumultuous history that made it a relevant landmark. But the world went on, and maybe because it was already old, maybe because it was so obviously medieval in a world that was now entering the Renaissance, or maybe due to the end of the 100 Years' War, it started a long decline, as if it was falling asleep. It was turned into a state prison, here again to take advantage of the tides to discourage jailbreak. Its prestige as a center of pilgrimage waned, and by the 16th century already, it no longer attracted crowds, and the number of Benedictine monks slowly declined. 200 years of lethargy passed, and by the time of the French Revolution, it had barely changed in 300 years, and there were scarcely any monks in residence anymore. There were still villagers living on the Mont Saint-Michel, and they had built stone and brick houses, but the abbey was slowly dying. It remained a prison until 1863, and had hundreds of inmates, until Napoleon III closed it. So in the 19th century, the Mount was now without purpose, and could have turned into a ruin. But it didn't, because of two things. First, the early development of tourism that drew people to picturesque sites, and that was one. So it was no longer for religious reasons or for safety, but after all these centuries, there were finally people willing to go to the Mount again. Second, and more importantly, because this was the time when historical buildings, the architectural heritage, started to be valued and often restored across Western Europe. And sometimes this heritage was even modified to make it more aesthetical or picturesque. And this is what happened to the Mount. The same architect that restored the Cathedral of Paris, Notre-Dame of Paris, Viollet-le-Duc, restored and added things to the Mount, especially the spire that tops it. Even though this spire is not authentic, it is a 19th century addition. It is true that it looks good. The site was also studied by archaeologists, and crypts or chapels that had been forgotten for centuries were rediscovered. For example, a small underground church under the abbey, called Notre-Dame sous terre, Our Lady Underground, a Romanesque church that was built even before the 11th century, under the larger Romanesque church on top of the rock. In the 1960s, the abbey that had in practice disappeared as an institution only the buildings remained, was symbolically refounded with new Benedictine monks returning. And since then, monks have come and gone. It no longer works as an abbey, but there is a monastic presence on top of the mount, like an echo of generations and generations of monks that lived there since the High Middle Ages. We have reached the end of our story for tonight. I'll be back soon with a new one. You can now let go and fall asleep, or pick another one from my library if you don't feel sleepy yet. Sleep well, sweet dreams, au revoir.